Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about fire sprinklers and your brewery, tasting room, and brew pub. Firewalls, fire sprinklers, and everything you need to know about it. First off, what's a fire sprinkler? You probably already know this, but let's go over basics. It's basically a bunch of water or chemicals that pipe through your space. If a fire happens, this little piece of glass breaks and then water comes shooting out of the pipes. It's about keeping people safe. That's what our job is as an architect, to make sure we're protecting the health, safety, welfare of the public. And that's one item that's crucially important, is making sure that if a fire happens, that people can exit safely before the fire gets to them and they're not trapped in a space. Here's why it's important for you as a brewery owner. By the 2015 International Building Code, and every jurisdiction is different, but we're going to use the 2015 IBC as our starting point. You have different fire hazards. So a fire hazard might be the risk of a fire happening in a space. So let's say you have a tire yard that has a bunch of rubber tires, and you got a house right next to it, right? One has more risk of a fire happening than another, right? If a fire happens in a tire yard, that's a huge deal, that's a big deal. The risk of a fire happening in a house is less likely, so you have to kind of have a separation between those two. So in a brewery, this is important because you have your brewing operations, which is a certain level of hazard. You have your tasting area typically, which not only is a different level of hazard, but has a lot of occupants in it. So you're bringing in a bunch of people into this area. And really, ideally in a brewery, what you want is you want to have a big open space. The idea of it is a tasting room or brew pub is you get to sit there, you get to enjoy the beverage while you're seeing it being made. Like that's the amazing thing about breweries, is you kind of get a peek behind the curtain and you get to see how things are going. That's great, except when you look at the difference between the risk of hazards between the two. If a fire were to happen in the brewing facility, then that fire can now cause harm to the people that are in your tasting room. So there's two ways to handle this. There's two ways to make sure that the different fire hazards don't affect each other. The first phase is a fire sprinkler. Easiest thing to do. You put a fire sprinkler in there, you're good. If a fire happens, water comes down, hopefully extinguishes the fire, and if at a minimum gives people enough time to get out of the space before it affects them. If you find a space that doesn't have a fire sprinkler, that's where we need to really look at getting creative. You have things called fire separations. There's different levels, and that's some technical stuff we won't get into here, but you have fire barriers, fire walls, fire separations. You'll hear this a lot of times, brokers maybe will talk about, oh, it's got a 2-hour wall, it's got a 1-hour wall. Well, those are fire separations. What that means is if a fire happens on one side of the wall and it gets to the wall, it'll take 1 hour for that fire to get to the other side of the wall. That gives everybody 1 hour of time to get out of the space and be safe. 2 hours gives it 2 hours, 3 hours gives you 3 hours, obviously. So that's what those mean, is a fire separation. So what that means is if you have a brewing facility with no fire sprinkler, you gotta have a firewall between them. So that kind of ruins the feel of it, right? That ruins the effect of how you feel when you're sitting in there drinking your beer and now you have a wall between you and the brewery. The other option is you put a bunch of glass in there, which is totally a totally valid option, but that glass has to be fire rated as well. And let me tell you, that's not cheap. If you want a lot of glass, there's certain limits on the size and how much glass you can have in there. Those pieces of glass are very expensive. So you want to try to limit that as much as possible. So when you're opening a brewery, you're opening a brew pub, you have a tasting area, first thing you look for, does it have a fire sprinkler? That should be the first question you ask, because if it doesn't have a fire sprinkler, that's really going to affect the feel of the space. That's going to affect how people use your space. That's going to affect the safety of the people. I will never advocate for not putting a fire sprinkler or a firewall in there. For one, it's code, you have to, but for two, it's about protecting the people. Right? If a fire happens, you got to keep them safe. So how do we get that same feel? You got to put a firewall with a window in it, or more importantly, just find a space with a fire sprinkler. Or you can add a fire sprinkler. I mean, that costs a lot of money as well, but those are all options you should be looking at early on when you're finding your space. So that's it. Things you need to look out for when you're opening your brewery, things you need to look for in terms of fire sprinklers and firewalls. We'll get you next time on the next top tip.